So in this session, I want to provide some thoughts, some guidelines in thinking about preparing for the final exam, some things to focus on, and highlight some things to pay attention to. Particularly, we're going to focus on the essay component of the final exam and not as much the other section. Remember that the final exam will consist of 3 parts: the study guide for the finals, of course, located on Blackboard. If you have any specific questions about any of the terms on the study guide or any of the questions, feel free to get in contact with me. Let me know what I can do to help you as you prepare for it. But as I mentioned, there'll be 3 parts. The first part will be much like the second exam, consisting of identification of individuals or movements or organizations. The second part of this first part will also consist of short answer questions. Again, very similar to what we saw on the second exam. Just try to, instead of including the multiple choice, just some more basic, just a couple sentences here and there talking about individuals and movements and developments in the Restoration movement, particularly focused on the 20th century. This part and part 2 will not be comprehensive. It will only cover material since the second exam. The second part of that final exam will be the essay for this unit. The possible topics are listed there on the study guide, and we'll focus on some of those here in a little bit. And the third part will be a comprehensive essay, and we'll talk about some of the things to pay attention to and prepare for with that. As I mentioned, if anything comes up in reviewing the study guide or after watching the video, feel free to get in contact with me for me to explain further, or if there's something that I didn't specifically address. So as I mentioned, I'm predominantly going to be focusing on information related to the essay component of the exam. But if you have questions about any of the terms or what I'm looking for with those terms, feel free to get in contact with me. The other thing to note is that if you are in a position of knowing those terms for that first part, you should be in a pretty good shape to talk about the unit essays, no matter what essay comes up, because a lot of those things are little pieces that the essays ask you to bring together. So keep that in mind as you are reviewing that. So let's discuss the possible essays for the unit essay component at part 2. There are 3 possible topics, and again, as usual, I provide you with 2 specific questions. You'll have the option to choose which one of those. One of the topics, of course, is non-institutionalism, one of the major controversies that affects the churches of Christ in the middle part of the 20th century. And so in talking about non-institutionalism, there are a couple of things that you will want to pay attention to. In your answer, you should be able to talk a little bit about the development of this. The one piece of the answer should be a discussion of the Sunday schools controversy. The differences that develop over the issue of whether or not a church should have a Sunday school. With many of these, of course, you will have similar types of arguments in that some people will support it, some people didn't. Some people supported it, some people didn't. But again, the focus, I'm looking for you to be more specific than that, talking about what was the problem with Sunday schools, what was the problem with the colleges, the orphan homes, a larger type of issues. And particularly, with the Sunday schools, you're thinking through and talking about, the kind of activities that a church should be involved in. And so this concern about what the major concerns that people had about Sunday schools. So in thinking about that, you want to be able to talk about the concerns that people had about Sunday schools, the concern that people had about colleges. You'll want to be able to talk about the Bible chair movement. You'll want to be able to talk about Daniel Summer and his opposition to colleges, so largely this kind of anti-elitism. But then also you'll want to be able to talk about the issue of financial support of colleges and this debate over whether a church can take funds that was generally collected in the weekly contribution and use those to help fund the operations of college as this kind of separate secular type of institution. And so thinking about the people that were involved in it, some of the major issues related to colleges. A third aspect, of course, would be orphan homes. Very similar type of argument about whether or not a church can take money out of the general fund contribution and collectively, right, send just to like individually, of course, people didn't have a problem. If you individually wanted to support a college or if you individually wanted to support an orphan home. But the question became more of the church, the collective congregation, taking funds out of its budget and applying it towards or donating it towards an orphan home or a college. And so you'll want to be able to discuss those kind of things. And then also the issues with cooperative missions, the Broadway plan, the sponsoring church plan, the Herald of Truth, and important individuals in there. That notion of can congregations cooperate together where they are providing funds to a congregation which then disperses them to a missionary or missionaries, or does it have to be a church supports a missionary? Unlike what developed in some of the other controversies related here, the issue wasn't so much about missionary work and a church supporting missionary work, but the question about can churches essentially provide money to a sponsoring church, and that church is responsible for the mission work, kind of a mission work by proxy, or contributing to mission work by proxy. You're contributing actually the funds to another congregation that will then disperse them to a missionary or missionaries. And including the Herald of Truth in there as an evangelistic work, which of course has similar types of issues of collectively working together. So in this essay, you'll want to talk about these four components and really be able to explain concisely within a couple sentences each of these things. You don't have to go into great detail, but you should be able to discuss these things and provide examples where necessary, where important, and just kind of highlight some of the overall issues. Same kind of thing when talking about the second possible essay, which had to do with the separation that took place within the disciples in the 20th century. You know, we had talked, of course, about the separation that occurred in the separation that occurred between the churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ for the last exam, but this one, of course, being focused more on the separation that took place in the disciples. And in talking about that division, there are a couple of things to focus on. First would be to spend a good deal of time talking about liberal theology, what it is, the impact it had on the disciples, and how that provided an opportunity for division to begin to occur, with some that adopted liberal theology with all that entailed, as well as those that rejected liberal theology. This, of course, is a part of the reason that the disciples and the churches of Christ had split, but you would want to also include this as, kind of these lingering theological issues. We tended to emphasize in talking about the separation between the disciples and the churches of Christ, we intended to emphasize the sociological issues and included theology in there, but liberal theology was a very important part of both divisions. A second important area to think about is the institutionalization that took place in the disciples. So you should be able to talk about the development of the United Christian Missionary Society, out of the American Christian Missionary Society, the Ford Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women's Board of Missions, some of those other issues. You know, talk about being able to not just talk about these, but listing the names, including the names of these specific organizations, would be very, very useful in talking about how did the disciples gradually move into this more institutional type of religious body, moving into a denominational type of organization, and the controversy that that led to because of the perceived decline in congregational autonomy. So you want to be able to talk about the International Convention of the Christian Church's Disciples of Christ, and what that was and how that fit into all this, and you know, the development of that rival North American Christian Convention. Another area that you will want to spend some time on is talking about the ecumenical outlook that began developing in the disciples that led to this split, this schism between the disciples and the Christian churches. So how, you know, how many disciples began to see themselves as one denomination among many, began to cooperate with other denominations on a variety of efforts. And you should also be able to talk about the open membership controversy and what that was and how that had an impact. Again, you don't have to go into all the details of how that worked out, but generally you should have a sentence or two about open membership, what it was, and the effect that it had. You know, that would be essentially you know, all that you would need to provide in that component of this course. This question. And then finally, you should say something about restructure, how it developed, what we're seeing in restructure, and then also, you know, how that's kind of the closing of the door between the disciples and Christians and the Christian churches, the independent Christian churches, and how this leads to, you know, a substantial division between the two groups as they go their separate ways. If one of the questions on the final exam in this section, the unit essay, is about the major controversies, of course, many of the things that you talked about for either of the previous essay or this separation essay would be a part of that. You could also talk about the International Churches of Christ, the so-called Boston movement, the controversy of the Holy Spirit. All of these are more recent discussions, and so, you know, just going back through your notes and doing something similar. What are the general overview of the Holy Spirit controversy, of the Boston movement, of, you know, some of the other aspects of those sections. We turn now to the comprehensive essay, and the essay will appear on the final exam as it appears in the study guide. That is the comprehensive essay you will have to answer. And certainly, so I would encourage you to think through some of those things. You know, it's not going to be a situation where you can cut and paste per se, but it is something that you could be thinking about, preparing for, you know, so that you are ready to discuss those elements. So in thinking about the comprehensive essay, there are a couple of things that you should be able to talk about in writing that essay. First of all, you should be able to talk about, now we're generally talking about a couple different components. First is kind of a backgrounds component. A second component is the 19th and 20th century development, and then the last component is kind of an evaluative component. So in the first section, you will want to talk about backgrounds to the Restoration movement. Now, we spent several classes at the beginning of the semester going through the backgrounds to the Restoration movement. Obviously, I don't want you to regurgitate all that information. So there are a couple of sections that I want to highlight. First, you should be able to talk about the Reformation. You wouldn't necessarily, and I note this in the essay component, you wouldn't necessarily have to be able to talk about all of the individuals, any sort of dates, etc., movements, but you should be able to talk about what is there from the Reformation that serves as an important background to the development of the American Restoration movement. That would be things like emphasis on Scripture, emphasis on the commonality of human beings, and then priesthood of all believers, as well as things related to scriptural silence. So, those would be some things that you would want to highlight from the Reformation, even though you don't necessarily need to talk about what Martin Luther did, what Ulrich Zwingli did, but just a general couple sentences about the Reformation, what's important out of the Reformation that has an impact on the American Restoration movement. You would also then want to talk about the development of Baconianism, Scottish common sense, right? Particularly this philosophical development of an inductive method to discover truth, a belief in taking things at face value, the ability to pull together truths out of the Bible, and the notion that everyone can do this. It is a common that if everybody used the right method, they would come to the same conclusions. These are some of the things that you would want to highlight in this section as you generally talk about the philosophical component. So you have this kind of theological component, philosophical component. Then you also have kind of an ecclesiastical component. With the development of the Glassite movement, the Haldanes, you would want to talk about, use the terms the Glassites and the Haldanes, even though you wouldn't have to talk about John Glass, Robert Sandeman, James Haldane, Robert Haldane. But what are some of the things that these movements developed that were important precursors for the American Restoration movement? Things like weekly communion, baptism by immersion, unity, other types of things. So go back to those notes and review some of the things, the components that are important out of the Glassite movement and the Haldanes for the development of the American Restoration movement. You would also want to talk about some of the consequences coming out of the American Revolution, the freedom of religion, the increased competition, the kind of anti-elitism. What are some of the major developments within religious life in the United States out of the Revolutionary War? Separation of church and state would be one. And not just listing them, but describing a little bit about how these are important for the development of the Restoration movement, right? Not just saying, well, that brought about religious freedom and it brought about a separation of church and state. Okay, well, why is that important to understanding where the Restoration movement came from? Now, how do these things highlight the developments that are taking place in our particular interests? In all of this, you should include, maybe a section here, maybe a section in the beginning, some of the major principles out of the Restoration movement. Now, these are things that we talked about both at the very beginning of the semester and at the very end of the content information. Tuesday's lecture about those principles, reiterating those principles, so I'm not going to really spend some time there, but just quickly review your notes and talk about some of the principles we've been highlighting for Restorationism. As we continue into the American backgrounds, of course, the Second Great Awakening, you wouldn't have to cover everything here, but particularly focusing on the West, the Cane Ridge Revival, how that's very important for Barton W. Stone. You can also, you don't have to, but you could talk about these other restorationist type movements like the Republican Methodists and the Christian Connection, which don't have a direct historical tie, but are important for seeing how a general interest in restoration was popping up in various centers in the United States in this late 18th, early 19th century. 3 names you definitely want to include in your essay that should be there, even though I said not to focus on names, but 3 that you would have to include would be Barton W. Stone and Thomas and Alexander Campbell. Here too, not looking for a rehashing of their entire life, but just kind of some basic overview of, Stone's experience in Cane Ridge and his separation from the Presbyterian Church, Thomas's experience of rejection from the Presbyterians, and his desire for Christian unity, Alexander Campbell's shaping by the Glassites and the Haldanes and some other things there related to that. Right? You wouldn't necessarily need to include that Thomas Campbell was a Scots-Irish, anti-burgher, old late seceder Presbyterian. Right? I'm not looking for you to say that, but I am looking for you to briefly give an overview, a historical look at what are the developments that are taking place in the lives of these 3 men, especially that are, pushing towards these origins. And then after that, you could, I forgot I'd put the principles later. So principles, this would be a good place to talk about the principles. What are some of the major things that are emphasized as the Campbell movement develops, as the Stone movement develops? What are some of the key concepts? Again, those are things we talked about in the very first lecture, we talked about in the very last content lecture. So those are things that should be pretty familiar to you. You would then want to talk about the development of these movements, what's taking place. Wouldn't have to be much, just a general discussion of, separating from the Presbyterians, separating from the Baptists, there's preaching that's going on, the ways in which people are being drawn to this movement. Focusing on a sentence or so about how the 2 groups are brought together. They decide to work together. They are an expression of this desire for unity. But then shortly after that, of course, you're going to talk about the issues that begin to divide. Here, of course, you don't have to talk about John McGarvey and Walter Scott and Isaac Arrett and David Lipscomb and some of the other individuals that we've highlighted. But if you can bring in David Lipscomb and Isaac Arrett and talk about them, that's good. But generally, a couple sentences that talk about what were some of the major issues that started even in the middle of that 19th century that started to split this movement into 2 groups, 2 identifiable, distinct groups again. And so being able to talk about those issues, not just the list of them, right? Economic issues and theological issues and urbanism, right? But having some sort of description. Well, what were the economic issues? Well, what was the issue with slavery? And so all those kind of things, I want a little bit more. Sometimes it can just be a couple words. Sometimes it would be a whole sentence. But something more than just a list of here are the 4 or 5 things that led to the division. And then also kind of tracing that out. How do these 2 religious bodies now go in different directions? Right? Sketching out the 20th century. Where do these groups go? If, for example, you talk about the Disciples of Christ split as your unit essay, you certainly don't want this section to be as large. But it can help you talk about some of those things, kind of trace out how that's dividing, trace out the direction the churches of Christ go. The non-institutional essay might be helpful for that. But again, no matter which essay you do in the unit essay section, this component of the comprehensive essay should be nowhere near as long. This would be much briefer. 2-3 sentences is pretty much all you would need, maybe 4 sentences to kind of trace out what are the directions that the 2 groups take as they move through the 20th century. But then the major third, the last third of your essay should be an evaluative component, talking about whether the Restoration movement is valid today, what kind of principles are applicable or useful, what, if any, should be abandoned, what kind of changes does the Restoration movement need to make, what contributions could the Restoration movement make to larger Christianity. And so doing an evaluation, not just saying, well, here's what took place, and here's where these people did, and here's how the two groups developed in the 20th century. So here we sit in the 21st century, and so what contributions can it be made, or should there be an interest in Restorationism? Is Restorationism a valid approach, or should it be like the disciples have suggested, Restorationism is not as important as Christian unity? And here, a lot of what could be useful for this section would be things that you might be able to draw out from Tuesday's lecture on Restorationism in the 21st century. That might provide some background material to talk about evaluating where particularly Churches of Christ stand. That's largely our focus, since that's our background at Faulkner University, something that a lot of us share taking the class. But really kind of thinking through some of the issues of what, now having looked at a historical overview of this movement, what are some things where there are some great strengths, contributions to be made, but what are some challenges, maybe some places that need to be adjusted? And so, don't forget this component. Frequently, this has been one that students leave off in a variety of courses, and I don't know if it's a matter of not wanting to make the judgment or forgetting to, in the rush of finishing up an exam, but make sure to include an evaluation of the Restoration ideal, the Restoration plea, whatever we want to call it, because that will be an important component of the grade. So make sure that you're answering all of those parts of the question. And like I said, the purpose of going through this is to try and help you coalesce some of these things, help you pay attention to what to focus on, and maybe that'll make it a little bit easier than trying to go through everything that we've gone through, all your notes, and try to figure out what to include and what to exclude. If you pay attention to these major components, you will write a very good essay. Well, that brings us to the end of this review. If you have any more specific questions or questions specifically related to your your grades, your success in this course, please feel free to contact me. Also related to evaluation, I of course send out an email. If you would please take the time, if you haven't already, to fill out the student evaluation form. This is very, very important to me because it is very helpful, especially since it's the first time I've taught this course. It would be very helpful for me if you could talk about what was useful, what worked, what didn't work, what more you would like to hear about, what you think might be something that would be excluded. Whatever I can do to improve this course for future students, since this is required of Bible majors, especially, I would greatly appreciate that. If you need information on how to contact or how to fill out the evaluation, please let me know. I've had a very enjoyable semester. I wish everybody the best as we finish out this semester, and we'll see you for the final exam.